The fork hovered halfway between my plate and my mouth when Daniel set the folder down on the table. The dining room was quiet in that fragile way evenings sometimes are after a long day. The overhead light cast a warm circle over the table, glinting softly off the silverware. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed beneath the low murmur of running water. Daniel didn't look angry. That was the strange part. He looked calm. Too calm. He placed the folder down, slowly aligning it with the edge of the table as if he'd rehearsed the movement before walking into the room. Across from me, Emily noticed it too. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass in her hand, the water inside trembling just enough to catch the light. It wasn't slammed or thrown, just placed there carefully like a bill that needed to be paid. "I think it's time we talk about divorce." For a moment, no one moved. Emily's glass trembled slightly in her hand. The clink of dishes from the kitchen drifted faintly through the dining room, and Emily, who had come by that evening to drop off some documents for an event she was planning, froze with a glass of water halfway to her lips. "Dad," what she whispered. Daniel didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me, steady and strangely distant, as if I were someone he'd already left behind. "We've been unhappy for a long time," he said, "and it's better to settle things cleanly. Settle things." That was the phrase he used, as if 43 years of marriage were a credit card statement waiting to be cleared. Emily's chair scraped softly against the floor. "You can't just say that like it's a business meeting." Daniel ignored her. The folder sat between us, thick and neatly clipped. Inside, I would later learn, were the documents he believed would end my life as I knew it. And the strange thing, the part people never expect when they hear this story, is that I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply reached forward and rested my hand on the folder. Because even in that moment, something inside me was already beginning to understand that this wasn't just about divorce. There was something else hidden beneath those papers. Something Daniel never imagined I would find. My name is Melissa Carter. I'm 67 years old, and until a few months ago, I believed my life was already written. Before we go further, if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Daniel and I had been married for 43 years. That's long enough to build an entire life together, long enough that your habits braid themselves so tightly with someone else's that you stop noticing where one life ends and the other begins. We met when I was 23, and he was 26, both of us still trying to figure out who we were. Daniel was ambitious even then, the kind of man who spoke about the future with quiet certainty, as if success were simply something waiting patiently for him. I was teaching part-time at a small elementary school outside Chicago when we met. By the time our daughter Emily was born a few years later, Daniel's career in financial advising was taking off, and it made sense for me to stay home. At least until the kids are older, we told each other, but life has a way of stretching temporary decisions into permanent ones. Emily grew up, and then Ryan came along 3 years later. Daniel's work grew more demanding, his clients wealthier, his office farther away in the city. Before I knew it, the years had folded into decades. I became the one who remembered birthdays, the one who kept the house running, the one who quietly managed the family accounts and bills while Daniel chased bigger and bigger deals at Whitaker and Rowe Financial Group. For most of those years, I believed we were happy, or at least stable. But if I'm honest, the changes didn't start the night he placed that folder on the table. They started months earlier in small moments that felt too insignificant to question at the time. The first thing I noticed was the scent. Daniel had never cared much about cologne. For most of our marriage, he smelled faintly of aftershave and the laundry detergent I used on his shirts. Then one evening, he walked in carrying a scent I didn't recognize, something sharper, expensive, almost sweet. "New client gift," he said when I asked. I remember nodding and letting it go. The second change was his phone. For years, Daniel had left it lying around the house without a second thought. Suddenly, it never left his pocket. If it buzzed while we were watching television, he'd glance at the screen and turn it face down. Once late at night, I woke up and noticed the faint glow of light under the bedroom door. Daniel was in the kitchen, talking quietly. When he came back upstairs, he told me it had been a client in California dealing with a time zone issue. It sounded reasonable. At least, that's what I told myself. After 40 years of marriage, you learn to trust the explanations that make life easier. Still, little details began to collect in the corners of my mind. Dinner meetings that ran late, weekends when he suddenly needed to stop by the office, receipts from restaurants in downtown Chicago that I knew weren't anywhere near his building. Each one was easy to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a quiet pattern I couldn't quite ignore. And somewhere beneath my patience, a slow unease began to grow. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that something in our life had shifted in ways I didn't fully understand. Which is why when Daniel finally placed that folder on the dining table that night, a small part of me wasn't entirely surprised. He slid it closer. "You should read through these," he said calmly. "They explain everything." The papers were neatly organized legal language signatures, financial summaries, divorce filings, asset disclosures, and something else. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression patient. As you'll see, he continued tapping the edge of the folder. "Most of the assets are in my name. My attorney believes it's better if we settle this quietly." Emily looked between us, her face pale. "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "It means," he said evenly, "that Melissa signing these papers now will save everyone a lot of unnecessary trouble." The room felt suddenly smaller, and as my fingers rested on the edge of that folder, I realized that Daniel Carter believed he had already won. He believed those papers would end the story. What he didn't know yet was that they were only the beginning. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous, and I could feel Emily's eyes shifting between us, trying to understand whether this was some kind of joke or the beginning of something much worse. Daniel simply waited. That calm expression hadn't changed. If anything, it looked practiced, like a man who had already rehearsed this conversation many times in his head. I slowly opened the folder. The first page was covered in legal language, dense and unfamiliar. Lines of typed paragraphs filled the page with words like petition dissolution marital estate. My eyes skimmed over the sentences without really understanding them. Behind me, the faint hum of the dishwasher continued. "Dad," Emily said carefully, "you can't just drop something like this during dinner." Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "It's better to be direct," he replied. "Dragging things out only makes it harder." I turned the page. More documents followed: financial disclosures, asset statements, tables of numbers that blurred together the longer I stared at them. I had spent decades managing our household budget. I knew what groceries cost, what the utilities ran each month, what our insurance payments looked like. But this was different. This was the language of lawyers. My fingers paused on a page filled with figures. "Daniel," I said quietly, "what exactly is this?" He didn't hesitate. "It's a settlement proposal," he said. "My attorney prepared everything so we can avoid unnecessary complications." Emily pushed her chair back slightly. "Avoid complications," she repeated. "You mean Mom just signs this and that's it?" Daniel's eyes flicked toward her briefly before returning to me. That would be the simplest option. Something in his tone made the room feel colder. I looked down again at the numbers on the page. Several columns listed accounts and properties, but beside many of them were small notes written in legal shorthand I didn't recognize. "This says most of the assets are yours?" I said slowly. Daniel nodded. "That's correct. But we've been married 43 years. "Yes?" "Then how?" he interrupted gently, almost kindly. "Melissa, the majority of our investments and accounts were established under my name through the firm. It's standard practice in my line of work." I stared at the paper again. Standard practice. The phrase sounded so reasonable, so simple, yet something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Emily leaned forward, her voice sharper now. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "They built everything together." Daniel's expression remained calm. "Your mother will be taken care of," he said. "There are provisions for temporary support. But contesting the agreement would only create unnecessary legal expenses." His gaze settled on me again. "And at your age, Melissa drawn-out litigation would be extremely stressful." There was a subtle shift in the room, then something quiet but unmistakable. Until that moment, I had still been hoping, foolishly perhaps, that this conversation was about the end of a marriage. But the documents in my hands made something else clear. Daniel wasn't just leaving. He had already decided what my future would look like. I turned another page. More legal paragraphs, more numbers. I understood enough to realize one terrifying possibility. "What happens if I don't sign this?" I asked. Daniel sighed softly, as though the question disappointed him. "Well, he said then we would have to let the court decide, and unfortunately, judges tend to rely heavily on financial documentation." He tapped one of the pages, most of which is in my name. Emily's chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That sounds like you're threatening her." Daniel's voice remained steady. "I'm explaining reality." For a long moment, none of us spoke. I could feel a dull pressure building behind my eyes, not quite tears, but something close. 43 years. 43 years of birthdays, school events, hospital visits, family vacations, mortgage payments, and quiet evenings like this one. And now it was all being summarized in a stack of paperwork. Daniel slid a pen across the table toward me. "You don't need to decide tonight," he said, "but the sooner this is resolved, the better it will be for everyone." Emily looked at me, her face pale. "Mom, you're not actually considering this, are you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I carefully closed the folder. My hands were steady, though inside I felt something close to panic. Because the truth was, I didn't understand the documents well enough to know whether Daniel was right. Maybe the accounts really were in his name. Maybe the courts really would side with him. Maybe after all these years, I had nothing. And that possibility, quiet and terrifying, began to settle heavily in my chest. Daniel stood from the table. "I'll leave the papers here," he said. "Take some time to read them." Then he walked out of the room. The front door closed a moment later. For several seconds, the house was silent except for the hum of the dishwasher. Emily moved to the chair beside me. "Mom," she said softly, "you don't have to go through this alone." I nodded, but the words barely registered. My attention had drifted back to the folder on the table. Something about the neatness of it bothered me. Every page perfectly aligned, every section labeled, prepared, planned. "How long do you think he's been working on this?" Emily asked quietly. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the folder again. This time, I forced myself to read more carefully. Some sections described accounts I recognized. Others listed companies or financial structures I didn't remember hearing about before. The language was technical, but certain phrases stood out. Ownership, transfer, advisory entities. I closed the folder again, slower this time. Emily was watching me closely. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I exhaled slowly. "For 43 years, I said, your father has handled the big financial decisions. That doesn't mean he gets everything." "No," I said quietly, "but it does mean he thinks he will." Emily reached for my hand. "So what do we do?" I looked once more at the stack of documents on the table. Fear was still there, heavy and cold, but beneath it, something else had begun to take shape. A small, stubborn thought. Daniel believed I didn't understand the paperwork, and in some ways, he was right. But I did understand one thing. People who were completely honest rarely rushed others to sign documents. "I'm not signing anything yet," I said finally. Emily let out a slow breath of relief. "Good." I nodded. Instead of closing the folder, I pulled one of the pages closer to the light and studied it again. Somewhere behind all this legal language, there was a story about our money. And if Daniel was so confident that I would simply accept his version of that story, then it meant he didn't expect me to start asking questions. I looked at Emily. "Do you remember Andrew Park?" I asked. She frowned slightly. "The accountant Uncle David used to recommend." "Yes." Emily's eyes widened a little. "You're thinking about talking to him." I closed the folder. "Not talking," I said quietly. "Investigating. Because if Daniel Carter believed those papers would end the story, then the first thing I needed to do was find out exactly what they were hiding." The next morning, the house felt unusually quiet. Daniel had already left for work. His coffee mug sat in the sink, and the faint smell of roasted beans lingered in the kitchen as if nothing had happened the night before. But the folder was still on the dining table. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking at it. 43 years of marriage had taught me many things about Daniel Carter, his habits, his moods, the careful way he planned every major decision in his life. What it had not taught me was how to read legal paperwork designed to dismantle that life. Still, I sat down and opened the folder again. This time, I wasn't trying to understand every legal paragraph. Instead, I focused on the numbers. Accounts, balances, transfer dates. Some of them I recognized immediately: our checking account, the retirement fund Daniel had mentioned many times over the years. Others were unfamiliar. Company names appeared beside certain transfers, along with notes referencing advisory structures and consulting arrangements I didn't remember hearing about before. One name appeared twice: Northbridge Advisory LLC. I frowned slightly and flipped back a few pages to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The name appeared again, later attached to another transfer several months apart. It might have meant nothing, but the repetition stayed in my mind. That evening, when Daniel returned home, I behaved exactly the way he seemed to expect: quiet, confused, slightly overwhelmed by the documents. At dinner, I asked a few careful questions. "Your lawyer said most of the accounts are in your name," I said. "Is that because of your clients?" Daniel barely looked up from his plate. "That's right. And these companies listed here, they're part of advisory structures," he replied calmly. "Standard financial arrangements." He spoke with the same steady confidence he used when explaining complicated investments to clients. I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders drop as if the explanation had settled everything. "I suppose I don't really understand how those things work," I said. Daniel's expression softened slightly. "It's complicated," he said. "That's why professionals handle it." But I noticed something else while he spoke. Daniel was watching me, not directly, just brief measuring glances across the table when he thought I wasn't looking. He was trying to decide whether I believed him, so I gave him exactly what he expected: uncertainty. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I returned to the dining table with a small notebook. One by one, I began copying the information from the folder: account balances, transfer dates, company names. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet, but writing the numbers down helped me see them more clearly. By midnight, several pages of notes filled the notebook. The next afternoon, I called Andrew Park. He answered on the second ring. "Andrew Park, speaking." "Andrew, this is Melissa Carter." "I'm not sure if you remember me." A brief pause followed. "Of course I remember you," he said warmly. "You and Daniel hosted that charity dinner a few years ago." "Yes. I'm sorry to call unexpectedly, but I was hoping you might have time to look at something for me." "What kind of something? Financial paperwork?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "I'm in the office most afternoons. Bring whatever you have." 2 days later, I drove into downtown Chicago. Andrew's office was modest compared to Daniel's firm, but it felt organized and calm. He greeted me personally and led me to a chair beside his desk. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. I slid several copied pages across the desk. These came from the divorce paperwork Daniel gave me. Andrew studied them silently for a few minutes. The only sound in the room was the faint tapping of his pen against the desk. Finally, he leaned back slightly. "These appear to be settlement disclosures," he said. "Yes, and Daniel's attorney prepared them." That's what he told me. Andrew nodded slowly as he looked through the pages again. "At first glance, there's nothing unusual about advisors holding assets through corporate entities," he said. A small knot of tension loosened in my chest. "So everything here is normal?" Andrew hesitated. "Normal doesn't always mean simple." He tapped one of the pages. "Northbridge Advisory LLC," he said. "Does that name mean anything to you? I've never heard Daniel mention it." Andrew flipped through the documents again. "These transactions involve consulting transfers and advisory accounts," he said. "Without the full financial records, it's difficult to see exactly how the money moves." "But something feels strange," I asked. Andrew looked up at me. "I'd like to see more documentation." Over the next week, I settled into a strange routine. During the day, I behaved exactly as Daniel expected, uncertain, even slightly intimidated by the legal paperwork. But at night, once he fell asleep, I returned to the documents. Slowly, patterns began to appear. At first, it was only small things. A transfer that moved through 2 accounts before landing under a company name I didn't recognize. Another payment that appeared in one statement then vanished from the next. I drew faint lines between the dates in my notebook, connecting numbers the way someone might trace a map. The more I looked, the clearer it became that these transactions weren't random. They followed a rhythm, money leaving one place, pausing briefly somewhere else, and then disappearing behind names like Northbridge Advisory. Others appeared briefly before disappearing entirely from later statements. None of it made complete sense yet, but it didn't feel accidental. One evening, Daniel paused in the doorway as I closed the folder. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Just trying to understand the paperwork." "You don't need to stress yourself with that," he said. "That's what lawyers are for." "I know," I replied. "But I'd like to understand what I'm signing." For a moment, he studied me carefully. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." The next morning, the folder was gone from the dining table. Daniel had moved it upstairs to his office, which meant he had begun to wonder how closely I was paying attention. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was folding laundry. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "Hello, Melissa," he said. His voice sounded different this time, more focused. "I've been reviewing the documents you brought. And..." There was a short pause. "I think you should come to my office," he said. My heart began to pound. "Did you find something?" Andrew exhaled quietly. "Yes," he said. "Something important." Andrew didn't explain much over the phone, just one quiet sentence. "Something important." The next morning, I drove into downtown Chicago again, my thoughts circling the same uneasy question the entire way there. If Daniel had been so confident that I would sign those papers, then why did these numbers feel so carefully hidden? Andrew was already waiting when I arrived. This time, there was no polite conversation about traffic or coffee. He closed the office door behind me and placed several printed pages on his desk. "I've been going through the transactions you copied," he said. I sat down across from him, my pulse suddenly louder in my ears. Andrew tapped the same company name I had noticed days earlier, Northbridge Advisory LLC. My chest tightened. "What about it?" He slid the papers toward me. "At first glance, it looks like a consulting intermediary. Financial advisors sometimes use outside entities to handle certain transactions. So it's normal." Andrew shook his head slightly. "Not the way it's being used here." He pointed to a sequence of transfers highlighted on the page. "Money leaves one advisory account," he said. "Then it moves through 2 intermediary transfers before landing under Northbridge." I leaned forward, and then Andrew looked up at me, and then it disappears. The words seemed to echo in the room. "Disappears," I repeated. "There's no consulting invoice," he explained. "No service documentation. No normal accounting record that explains why the money ends up there." My eyes dropped to the numbers again. "So what is Northbridge?" Andrew hesitated for a moment before answering. "It appears to be a shell company." For a few seconds I couldn't speak. A shell company. The phrase belonged to corporate scandals and courtroom documentaries, not the quiet suburban life Daniel and I had built together for 4 decades. "But Daniel works for a major financial firm," I said finally. "Wouldn't something like that be illegal?" Andrew nodded slowly. "If the funds being transferred belong to client accounts or managed portfolios, then yes. Diverting money through an undisclosed entity could qualify as financial fraud." My stomach tightened. "How much money are we talking about?" Andrew flipped to another page. "From the partial records you brought, at least $240,000 moved through Northbridge within the past year. $240,000. The number settled heavily between us. "And that's only what appears in these documents," Andrew added quietly. I stared down at the page again, suddenly seeing Daniel's careful habits in a different light. The late nights, the private phone calls, the urgency behind the divorce paperwork. He hadn't just been ending a marriage, he had been protecting something. "This was planned," I said softly. Andrew nodded. The transfers follow a structured pattern. Money moves through multiple stages before it reaches Northbridge. That kind of layering is designed to make the original source harder to trace. I leaned back in the chair, feeling a strange shift inside my chest. Daniel had believed I would sign those papers quietly, walk away, never question the financial story he had written. But now the numbers told a different one. If the court reviews these accounts, I said slowly, Northbridge becomes part of the assets the court will examine. That's correct, Andrew replied. And if the firm discovers the diversion, Andrew's voice remained calm. Your husband could lose his advisory license and possibly face a criminal investigation. For the first time since Daniel placed the divorce folder on the dining table, the fear that had been sitting in my chest began to change shape. It was still there, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. He thinks I'm helpless, I said quietly. Andrew gave a faint smile. That assumption may be the biggest advantage you have. 2 days later, I sat across from Rebecca Lawson, a divorce attorney Andrew had recommended. Rebecca read through the documents carefully, her expression calm and professional. Your husband's proposal assumes you won't challenge the financial disclosures, she said. That's what he expects. Rebecca closed the folder. Then we respond with our own filing. Over the next hour, she prepared the paperwork. Instead of accepting Daniel's settlement terms, the document demanded a full forensic accounting review of all marital assets connected to his advisory work. Northbridge Advisory LLC was listed directly in the request. Rebecca turned the screen toward me. If Daniel wants this divorce, she said, then the court will examine every dollar involved. I signed the document. Rebecca gathered the pages together. There's one more step, she added. What's that? We request a temporary freeze on the financial accounts connected to the case while the review is conducted. The words hung in the air for a moment. Which accounts? I asked. All of them. I took a slow breath. Do it. Rebecca filed the documents that afternoon. By the time Daniel returned home that evening, the court order had already been issued. The accounts tied to the case, including those connected to Northbridge Advisory, were now frozen. And for the first time since Daniel Carter placed that folder on the dining table, I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you discovered that someone you trusted for decades had secretly moved money through hidden companies, what would you do? Would you walk away quietly or fight to uncover the truth? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. Daniel came home earlier than usual that evening. I heard the front door open while I was standing at the kitchen counter rinsing a glass that didn't actually need washing. The sound of his footsteps moved quickly through the hallway, heavier than normal, sharper somehow. Then he appeared in the doorway. His expression told me immediately that he knew. What did you do? Daniel asked. He wasn't shouting yet, but the calm voice he had used over the past week was gone. I dried my hands slowly with a towel. What do you mean you know exactly what I mean? He stepped into the kitchen and placed his phone on the counter. My firm just informed me that several accounts have been temporarily frozen. I met his eyes. Yes, I said quietly. That would be because of the court filing. For a moment, Daniel simply stared at me, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the version of me he believed he knew. You filed something, he asked. I requested a forensic accounting review of our marital assets. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. Daniel's jaw tightened. You had no right to do that. I believe I do, I replied. His voice rose slightly. You're interfering with financial accounts you don't even understand. I leaned against the counter, forcing my voice to remain steady. I understand enough. Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. No, Melissa, you don't. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the kitchen floor before turning back toward me. Do you have any idea what kind of problems this creates for me at the firm? He demanded. I imagine it creates questions. You're making a mistake, he said sharply. The tension in the room thickened. For years, I had watched Daniel handle difficult conversations with the same quiet authority he used with his clients, but now that authority felt different, less confident, more urgent. And then the front door opened again. Daniel's head turned toward the hallway. A moment later, a woman stepped into the kitchen. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s perhaps, with dark hair pulled neatly over one shoulder and the kind of polished confidence that suggested she was accustomed to walking into rooms where she already believed she belonged. Daniel looked surprised. "Natalie," he said, "what are you doing here?" Her eyes moved from him to me with a cool, assessing glance. "You weren't answering your phone," she replied. "I thought something might be wrong." The air in the kitchen shifted again. So this was Natalie Pierce, the woman whose name I had only recently learned. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Natalie looked back at Daniel. "Are you going to explain what's happening?" she asked. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Melissa decided to involve the court in our financial situation." Natalie's gaze returned to me. "That seems unnecessary." Her tone was polite, but there was something faintly dismissive underneath it. I studied her calmly. "Is it?" She crossed her arms. "From what Daniel told me, everything was already arranged. I'm sure he believed that." Daniel stepped forward, his voice tight. "This conversation doesn't involve you," he said to me. "I think it does." I reached across the counter and pulled a small folder from beneath the stack of mail. Inside were copies of the documents Andrew and Rebecca had helped me prepare. I placed them on the counter between us. Natalie glanced down first. "What is this financial records?" I said. Daniel didn't move, but the moment he saw the name on the page, his expression changed. "Northbridge Advisory, LLC." Natalie looked up again. "What's that supposed to mean?" I kept my voice level. "It means the court will be reviewing every account connected to Daniel's advisory work." Daniel's eyes flashed. "You have no idea what you're talking about." $240,000 moved through that company last year, I said quietly. The kitchen fell silent. Natalie looked slowly from me to Daniel. "Daniel." He didn't answer immediately. For the first time since this conversation began, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "That's not what it sounds like," he said finally. I nodded. "That's exactly what the forensic accounting review will determine." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you're being clever," he said. "But this isn't a game." "No," I replied. "It isn't." Natalie shifted her weight slightly, her earlier confidence fading. "Daniel, what company is she talking about?" He didn't respond. I picked up the papers again and slid them back into the folder. The court filing also froze the accounts connected to the case, I added calmly. Daniel stared at me. "You froze them?" "Yes." His voice dropped into something colder. "You've just made a very serious mistake." "Possibly," I said. "But at least now everything will be examined properly." For several seconds, the three of us stood there in silence. Then I walked past them toward the front door. "This conversation is over," I said. Daniel didn't move. Natalie looked uncertain now, glancing between us. I opened the door. "You should both leave." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You're throwing me out of my own house." "For tonight," I said. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Natalie picked up her purse from the counter. "Daniel," she said quietly, "maybe we should go." Daniel hesitated, then turned toward the door. He paused as he passed me. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know." They stepped outside. I closed the door behind them. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed through the quiet house. For several seconds I stood there, my hand still resting on the handle. Only then did my body begin to shake, not from fear, from the sudden release of it. But even as the tremor ran through my hands, one thing had become unmistakably clear. For the first time since Daniel Carter asked for a divorce, I was no longer the one reacting to his moves. Now I was making them. The house felt different after that night, as if something invisible had shifted. Not quieter exactly, Daniel had already been spending less time there during the weeks leading up to the divorce, but emptier in a way that was both unsettling and strangely calm. For the first time in days, no one was arguing across the dinner table. No one was watching me carefully, measuring every word. But the silence didn't last long. The first message arrived the next morning. It was an email from Daniel's attorney, Claire Whitfield. The subject line alone made my stomach tighten. Legal notice regarding financial interference. I opened it slowly. The letter was written in the formal language lawyers preferred, calm, polished, and precise, but the meaning beneath the words was unmistakable. Claire Whitfield accused me of interfering with Daniel's professional financial accounts. The message warned that my request for a forensic accounting review could cause irreparable reputational harm. She strongly recommended that I withdraw the filing immediately. Otherwise, the letter continued, Daniel would be forced to consider additional legal remedies. I read the message twice before closing the laptop. Threats. That had taken less than 24 hours. Later that afternoon, the phone began ringing. At first, I ignored it, but the calls continued. Most of them came from numbers I didn't recognize. When I finally answered one, Daniel's voice filled the line. "Melissa," he said sharply, "you need to stop this." "I don't think so. You're interfering with things you don't understand." "I understand enough." There was a long exhale on the other end of the line. "You're letting people manipulate you," he said. "I'm asking questions," I replied calmly. "That's all." Daniel was silent for a moment. "You think you're protecting yourself," he said finally, "but you're making this worse." Then the line went dead. The voicemail messages started later that evening. The first message was short. "Melissa, call me back." The second arrived about 20 minutes later, his voice tighter this time. "We need to talk about this." By the third message, the calm tone Daniel used with clients had disappeared completely. His words were faster now, edged with something I had rarely heard from him before. Fear. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand, listening to the recordings one after another, while the quiet house amplified every word. "You're making a mistake," his voice said in the final message. Then the line went silent. I turned the phone face down on the table. Instead, I called Emily. She arrived an hour later carrying 2 bags of groceries and the determined expression she had inherited from my side of the family. "Okay," she said, setting the bags down. "First rule, you're not answering any more of those calls." I wasn't planning to. Second rule, she continued, pulling out her phone. "Everything gets saved. Saved emails, voicemails, texts, anything they send. We document everything." I watched her for a moment. "You've done this before." Emily shrugged. "Divorces get messy." Over the next few days, the pressure continued. More emails arrived from Claire Whitfield's office, each one carefully written and increasingly urgent. The messages warned that prolonging the legal process could damage Daniel's career and dramatically increase legal costs for both sides. One email hinted that a revised settlement agreement might be possible if I withdrew the request for a forensic accounting review. I showed that one to Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca read it quietly before leaning back in her chair. "They're nervous," she said. "About what? The financial investigation." "So the offer is real." "Oh, it's real," Rebecca replied. She slid the printed email back toward me. "But it's also a distraction." "How so?" Rebecca folded her hands together. "If the records were clean, they wouldn't be pushing you this hard to stop looking." I stared down at the message again. For a moment, the temptation was real. Ending the investigation would mean ending the conflict. No more threatening emails. No more voicemail messages filling my phone. No more long nights wondering what Daniel might try next. All I had to do was withdraw the request, but then the image of those transfers appeared in my mind again. Money leaving one account, moving quietly through another, disappearing into Northbridge Advisory. "No," I said finally. Rebecca smiled slightly. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." 2 days later, the phone rang again. This time it was Claire Whitfield herself. Her voice was calm and controlled. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "I believe we can resolve this situation quickly if you're willing to reconsider your current position." "What position is that?" "The forensic accounting request." "And what exactly are you offering? A revised settlement arrangement?" she replied smoothly. "One that would provide you with greater financial security while avoiding unnecessary legal complications." I almost laughed. Financial security? Yes. In exchange for ignoring the accounts connected to Northbridge Advisory, there was a brief pause on the line. "That entity is not relevant to the divorce proceedings." "That's interesting." I said quietly. Because the court seems to think it might be. Her tone cooled slightly. You should consider the consequences of continuing this course of action. I already have, and I'm not withdrawing the request. The line went silent for a moment. Very well, she said finally. The call ended. By the time I returned home that evening, Emily was already there again. But she wasn't alone. A tall man stood beside her in the living room. For a moment I didn't recognize him. Then he turned. Hi, Mom. Ryan. My son crossed the room and pulled me into a tight hug. I caught the first flight I could, he said. Emily grinned behind him. I might have told him things were getting intense. I looked from one of them to the other. You didn't have to do that. Ryan shook his head. Yeah? He said quietly. We did. For the first time since Daniel placed those divorce papers on the dining table, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone anymore. Melissa was halfway through reviewing the documents when she heard it. A car door closing outside, not the quick slam of a delivery driver or a neighbor stopping by. This one was slower, deliberate. She froze for a moment, pen still hovering above the yellow legal pad. Another door shut. Melissa turned her head toward the living room window. Through the thin lace curtain, she saw a black SUV parked along the curb. Her stomach tightened instantly. Daniel stepped out from the driver's side. Natalie followed from the passenger seat, smoothing down the front of her coat as if she were arriving somewhere important. Melissa didn't move. For weeks now, every interaction with them had felt like a carefully staged confrontation, but this one felt different. Final. Daniel walked up the path toward the house. Natalie stayed half a step behind him. A second later, the knock came. 3 firm raps against the door. Melissa stood slowly and walked across the living room. She opened the door before they could knock again. Daniel smiled immediately, that same practiced, reassuring smile he had used for years whenever he wanted to calm an argument. Melissa, he said lightly, we just wanted to talk. Behind him, Natalie stood with her arms folded. Her expression carried a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Then Melissa noticed the ring. Natalie lifted her hand slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The diamond flashed in the sunlight. Large, deliberate. Well, Natalie said, noticing where Melissa's eyes had landed. I suppose you'll hear about it sooner or later. Daniel placed a hand casually on Natalie's shoulder. We're engaged. Melissa studied them for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Come in. Daniel looked faintly relieved. Natalie walked into the house first this time. Her eyes moved slowly around the living room, taking in every corner like someone evaluating a property. You redecorated, she said. I cleaned, Melissa replied calmly. They sat down at the dining table. The same table where Daniel had once insisted they discuss investments. The same table where Melissa had discovered the first missing transfer. Daniel folded his hands. Look, he began carefully. Tomorrow's hearing doesn't have to become unpleasant. Melissa rested her palms lightly on the table. That depends on you. Natalie leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. Oh, please, she said. You're acting like you actually have something. Melissa didn't respond. Natalie turned the diamond ring slowly on her finger. You filed a complaint? She continued. Fine. People do that all the time. Daniel nodded. But realistically, he added, these things rarely go anywhere. He leaned back, crossing his arms. And dragging it out could damage everyone. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Everyone. Daniel gestured casually. You, me, Natalie. Natalie smiled thinly. And the court doesn't usually appreciate someone trying to create drama because she's emotional. Melissa said nothing. Instead, she reached beside her chair and pulled a folder from the stack of papers. She slid it across the table. Daniel hesitated before opening it. Natalie rolled her eyes. What is this supposed to be? She muttered. Daniel flipped through the pages. His expression shifted slowly. Confusion, then disbelief, then something colder. Fear. He stopped at one particular document near the back. How did you get this? He asked quietly. Melissa folded her hands together. the same way the insurance company did. Natalie leaned forward impatiently. "What is it?" Daniel didn't answer. Melissa spoke instead. "It's a background report." Natalie scoffed, so Melissa met her eyes. "From 3 years ago." Natalie's smile tightened. Daniel closed the folder abruptly. "That doesn't prove anything," he said quickly. Melissa slid another page across the table. "This one does." Natalie snatched it before Daniel could react. Her eyes scanned the page. For the first time since arriving, her confidence flickered. "That was dismissed," she said sharply. Melissa shook her head. "No." She tapped the highlighted line near the bottom. "It wasn't dismissed." Natalie's voice rose. "It was sealed." Daniel turned toward her quickly. Melissa remained calm. "The court records say otherwise?" Natalie pushed the paper back across the table. "You think anyone will care about something from years ago?" Melissa didn't blink. "They will when they see the pattern." Daniel stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. "This is ridiculous." Melissa stayed seated. "Is it?" Daniel pointed at the folder. "You're digging up old paperwork to embarrass Natalie." Melissa leaned forward slightly. "No," she said quietly. "I'm documenting fraud." The room went completely still. Natalie stared at her. "You're bluffing." Melissa shook her head. "I already submitted the documents." Daniel's eyes narrowed. To the court, Melissa nodded once, and to the investigator assigned to the hearing. Natalie turned toward Daniel immediately. "You said she had nothing." Daniel didn't respond. The silence between them stretched long enough for Melissa to feel the balance in the room shift. For weeks they had spoken to her like she was powerless, like everything had already been decided. But now neither of them looked certain anymore. Natalie stood up so abruptly that the chair legs screeched against the floor. "You think this changes anything?" she snapped. Melissa met her gaze calmly. "It already has." Daniel closed the folder slowly. "You still have time to withdraw the complaint." Melissa didn't move. "And if I don't?" Daniel stepped closer to the table. His voice dropped. "Then tomorrow is going to be very unpleasant for you." Natalie crossed her arms again, the diamond catching the kitchen light. "You should think carefully about what happens after the hearing," she added. Melissa looked from one to the other. Daniel turned toward the door, but just before leaving he stopped and looked back. His voice carried a quiet threat. "If you walk into that hearing tomorrow," he said slowly, "you're going to regret it." The door closed behind them. The house fell silent again. Melissa sat there for several seconds. Then she pulled the yellow legal pad closer. At the top of the page, she wrote one final line. "Bring original documents." She underlined it twice. Tomorrow morning she would walk into that hearing, and this time she would be ready. The courthouse was already crowded when Melissa arrived. Morning sunlight spilled across the wide marble steps, but inside the building the air felt colder, quieter, formal, serious. Melissa paused near the entrance for a moment, adjusting the strap of her bag. Inside it were the original documents she had underlined on her legal pad the night before. Across the lobby, two familiar figures were already waiting. Rebecca Lawson stood near the security desk reviewing a folder with quick, precise movements. Beside her was Andrew Park scrolling through something on his tablet. Rebecca noticed Melissa first. She gave a small nod. "Good," she said when Melissa approached. "You're early." Andrew glanced up. "That helps," he added. "We may need time." Melissa took a slow breath. "Are they here?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly toward the hallway. "They arrived 10 minutes ago." Melissa followed her gaze. Daniel stood near the courtroom doors speaking in low, agitated whispers to his attorney. Natalie sat beside him. The diamond ring was still on her finger, but her posture looked different today, rigid, uneasy. For a brief moment, Daniel looked up. His eyes met Melissa's across the hallway. The confidence he had shown at her house yesterday was gone. Rebecca closed the folder. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go." The courtroom was smaller than Melissa expected. Rows of wooden benches filled quickly with observers, attorneys, and clerks moving quietly between tables. At the front sat Judge Linda Alvarez. Her expression was calm, unreadable. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. then sat. Melissa kept her hands folded in front of her as the hearing began. Rebecca Lawson stood first. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "this preliminary hearing concerns documented discrepancies in reported income and asset transfers connected to Daniel Carter." Daniel shifted in his chair. Rebecca continued, "Our review identified multiple financial filings that appear inconsistent with banking records and insurance declarations." Andrew Park stood beside her, placing several documents onto the evidence table. These include underreported income, undisclosed transfers, and evidence suggesting intentional misrepresentation. Daniel's attorney rose immediately. Objection. Judge Alvarez lifted a hand slightly. "You will have an opportunity to respond." Rebecca nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned one page in the binder. "In addition, we have a witness who can confirm the reporting discrepancies from a corporate perspective." She looked toward the back of the courtroom. "Mr. Thomas Carter." A murmur moved through the room. Melissa felt her pulse quicken. Thomas stepped forward slowly. Daniel's brother looked uncomfortable but determined. He took the witness seat. Andrew Park approached him. "Mr. Carter," Andrew said calmly, "can you confirm your role at Carter Logistics during the period referenced in these filings?" Thomas nodded. "I handled internal reporting." Andrew held up one document. "Were these figures accurate?" Thomas looked down, then shook his head. "No." Daniel's chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That's a lie." His voice echoed through the courtroom. Judge Alvarez looked directly at him. "Mr. Carter." Daniel clenched his jaw but sat back down. Andrew continued. "Mr. Carter, can you explain why the numbers differ?" Thomas hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Because Daniel asked me to report them that way." The courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel stood up again. "This is ridiculous." His voice was louder now. "He's twisting things." Judge Alvarez's voice cut through the room. "Mr. Carter, you will remain seated." Daniel dropped back into his chair, breathing hard. At that moment, Natalie suddenly leaned forward, pressing a hand against her stomach. Her attorney looked concerned. "Are you all right?" Natalie nodded quickly, but the movement caught the judge's attention. Judge Alvarez glanced down at the file in front of her, then back at Natalie. "Ms. Carter," she said evenly, "the court notes that certain financial transfers were recorded shortly before this hearing." Natalie's face tightened. Rebecca spoke calmly. "Those transfers coincide with medical payments." The room shifted again. Daniel turned toward Natalie sharply. "You didn't," Natalie's voice cut him off. "I was going to tell you." Several people in the courtroom exchanged quiet looks. Andrew Park placed another document on the table. "The timing suggests those payments relate to prenatal care." A ripple of whispers moved across the benches. Natalie's hand remained on her stomach. Daniel stared at her. "You're pregnant." Natalie didn't answer. The silence itself became the answer. For the first time since the hearing began, Daniel looked completely unsteady. And if you had been sitting in that courtroom at that exact moment, what would you have thought? Tell me in the comments. And if this story has you hooked so far, tap the like button so more people can find it. Judge Alvarez finally leaned forward. Her voice was measured. "This court has heard sufficient preliminary testimony regarding the financial discrepancies presented." She looked down at the documents again, then raised her eyes toward both legal teams. "My preliminary ruling is as follows." 30 days later, the courthouse felt different. The same marble steps, the same quiet hallways, but the tension that had filled the building during the first hearing was gone. This time, the outcome was already moving in one direction. News had spread quickly after Judge Linda Alvarez's preliminary ruling. Within 2 weeks, investigators had confirmed the discrepancies Rebecca Lawson and Andrew Park presented in court: bank transfers, underreported income, insurance filings that didn't match corporate records, and finally, the grand jury indictment. Daniel Carter had been formally charged with financial fraud. Melissa learned about it the same way everyone else did, through a short article posted online. She didn't feel satisfaction reading it, just a strange sense of stillness. The collapse that Daniel had once warned her about had arrived, but it hadn't been hers. Carter Logistics removed Daniel from his executive position less than a week after the indictment. The board issued a statement about maintaining corporate integrity. Melissa read that one quietly, too. Natalie, however, disappeared much faster. 2 days after the indictment, she packed her belongings from the condo Daniel had been renting downtown. No forwarding address, no explanation. Just gone. The only detail Melissa heard later came from Rebecca Lawson. She left the state, Rebecca said simply. Melissa didn't ask where. By the time the final civil hearing arrived, the courtroom looked calmer than before. Fewer observers, fewer whispers. Daniel sat at the defense table, but he looked smaller now. His suit was still expensive, but the confidence that once filled the room around him was gone. Judge Alvarez reviewed the final documents. Rebecca Lawson stood beside Melissa, presenting the last summary of financial evidence. The pattern of fraud was clear now. Misreported income, hidden transfers, and assets that Daniel had attempted to move out of joint accounts before the investigation began. Judge Alvarez closed the folder in front of her. Based on the evidence presented, she said evenly, the court finds substantial financial misconduct. Daniel lowered his head. The asset division will therefore reflect the documented ownership and verified contributions of the parties involved. Rebecca placed one final document before the judge. Judge Alvarez reviewed it briefly before continuing. Melissa Carter retains full control of the jointly held residence, the verified investment accounts, and the recovered funds identified during the investigation. Daniel remained motionless. The remaining liabilities connected to the misreported financial activity will remain the responsibility of Mr. Carter. A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom, but Melissa barely heard it. The ruling sounded almost distant, not dramatic, not triumphant, just final. Judge Alvarez closed the case file. This concludes the civil proceedings. The gavel struck once. Daniel stayed seated while the room slowly began to empty. Melissa gathered her papers carefully. Rebecca Lawson gave her a small, approving nod. Well done, she said quietly. As Melissa turned toward the exit, Daniel finally spoke. Melissa. His voice sounded unfamiliar. She paused. Daniel stood slowly. For several seconds he didn't seem able to find the words. Then he said them anyway. I should have told the truth sooner. Melissa studied his face. There was no anger in it anymore, just exhaustion. I know that doesn't change anything, he continued, but I'm sorry. The apology hung awkwardly between them. Too late. Too small. Melissa didn't argue. She didn't accuse him either. She simply nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. Outside, the afternoon light was warm. Waiting near the steps were the people who had stood beside her through everything, her children. They looked relieved when they saw her. Melissa walked down the steps toward them. For the first time in months, the weight she had been carrying felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect again, but because the truth had finally been heard, and the fight was finally over. The criminal trial took less time than most people expected. By the time it began, the evidence was already overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, corporate filings that no longer matched the story Daniel had told for years. Rebecca Lawson later explained it simply. Once the pattern was clear, she said there wasn't much left to argue. Daniel Carter was convicted of financial fraud and sentenced to prison. The news appeared briefly on local media, a small article, a few lines about corporate misconduct. Then the world moved on. Melissa did too. About 3 months after the civil case ended, she sold the house, not because she had to, but because she no longer wanted to live inside the memories it carried. Too many arguments at the dining table. Too many nights wondering where the missing money had gone. Too many mornings pretending everything was normal. Instead, she bought something smaller. A quiet cottage just outside the city. It had a wide wooden porch and a small garden that hadn't been taken care of in years. Melissa liked that part. Starting with something a little messy felt honest. The first thing she planted was lavender. The second was rosemary. Her children visited often now. Not out of obligation, but because the cottage felt peaceful. Some weekends they helped fix the old fence. Other weekends they simply sat on the porch together talking about ordinary things again. Melissa also did something she hadn't done in years. She traveled, not far at first. Just small trips, coastal towns, quiet lakes, places where nobody knew her name. She enrolled in a few classes at a local community college, too. Photography, creative writing, things she had once postponed because life felt too complicated. And occasionally, very occasionally, she even allowed herself to go on a date. Nothing dramatic, just coffee, conversations. The slow reminder that life didn't end with one chapter. Daniel's life moved in the opposite direction. The company that had once carried his name removed it from every document. Former colleagues avoided speaking about him, and the prison sentence became the only headline attached to his reputation. Natalie's story surfaced later. Journalists eventually uncovered the sealed records Melissa had mentioned in court, past fraud investigations, multiple aliases used over the years. By the time those stories reached the public, Natalie had already disappeared again. No one seemed to know where she went. Melissa didn't follow the updates. She didn't need to. One late afternoon, nearly a year after the hearing, Melissa sat in her garden. The lavender had begun to bloom. The air smelled soft and warm. She rested her hands in her lap and looked out across the small yard. For a long time, she had believed the hardest part of the story was the betrayal. But now she understood something different. Sometimes the real ending isn't about winning, it's about finally being able to live without looking over your shoulder. If you had been in Melissa's place, would you have fought the way she did? Or walked away much earlier? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it. You can also share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you enjoy stories like this, quiet, real, and a little closer to life than fiction, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next story. And tonight, I'm just grateful for the quiet.